So it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Chris Nicholl, who will present Jail is Not a Pleasant Experience. Some of you may have joined us earlier in February at the Penrose House during our last event where we got to see people. We heard Chris's presentation, but today's is an enhanced version, including more recent research that Chris has included in this presentation. She is an associate of the Special Collections of the Pikes Peak Library District. She is a co-founder of the library's annual Pikes Peak Regional History Symposium and co-editor and contributor to the Regional History Series, which is the published symposium proceedings. Her essay, Dr. Carolyn Spencer and the Colorado Springs Radicals for Reform about the region's militant suffragists, appears in Extraordinary Women of the Rocky Mountain West from the 2007 Symposium. So we are so honored and so pleased that Chris is sharing her scholarly work with us today. And Chris, screen share away and let's welcome Chris. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Roxanne. And thank you all for joining me today. And also want to thank the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum and the Historic Preservation Alliance for inviting me to read to you my story of some courageous women who gave up their freedom to win a woman's suffrage amendment to the U.S. Constitution. I'm sorry, it looks like my screen is not turning, Roxanne or Meg. I'm not sure what to do here. Oh, there it goes. Okay, it must have been me not pushing hard enough. Well, at least 6 local women, Dr. Carolyn Spencer, Natalie Gray, Bertha Arnold, Ida Ostrom, Ava Decker, and Genevieve Williams were among the nearly 2,000 members of the National Woman's Party, which was the militant wing of the women's suffrage movement that stood picket in peaceful political demonstrations in Washington, D.C. From early 1917 through late 1919, the women held suffrage pickets, marches, and pageants at the gates of the White House, in the Capitol building, and at Lafayette Square. Their political activism was nonviolent, carried out by silent demonstrators, armed with banners and posters that demanded women's political equality. Although protected by the First Amendment and with full knowledge of officials, including President Woodrow Wilson, the women endured verbal and physical abuses from hostile mobs, including uniformed police and military. 500 were arrested for obstructing traffic, and 168 were sentenced to jail for up to 7 months. The jailhouse conditions were terrible. Protesters were treated as criminals, denied basic comforts such as soap and clean bedding. Mail and visitors, and at times even attorneys, were barred. They were offered rancid, wormy food, some hunger-struck in protest, demanding to be treated as the political prisoners that they actually were. Those women endured further torture. Some were forcibly fed and brutalized by various jail officials. The women's courage paid off on August 26, 1920, in a great bloodless revolution, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment for Women's Suffrage, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, became law. Now, I'm using the word revolution, and what's this meaning? I'm talking about a peaceful overthrow of the political and social system to make way for a new system, and in this case, one that included females. And I also want to share with you the text of that Susan B. Anthony or 19th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged in the United States or by any state on account of sex. Now I'm going to step back here to the year 1893, where Kathy Sturdivant took us last week, when we had another landmark political revolution that occurred when Colorado's women won the suffrage through a public referendum. And this was the first time in American history that men voted for women to vote, making Colorado's women citizens in their own right. With their votes, Colorado's new citizens very quickly won some much needed reforms. By around 1900, they had ensured a mother's co-guardianship of children. They had raised the female age of consent from 16 to 18. They had built an orphanage and state industrial school for girls and enforced legislation barring child labor. Those achievements fueled arguments for the extension of women's suffrage to the other states. Throughout the nation, many women, millions of women in fact, worked in industry, agriculture, service jobs, often in unsafe conditions. Single women owned property and paid taxes, but they couldn't vote. If a Colorado woman moved to a non-suffrage state, which was pretty much just about everywhere, she lost the vote. She was no longer a citizen, as her citizenship matched her husband's. The custody of her children reverted to the father or stepfather. In many localities, she could not serve on juries or hold property and her own wages, even in her own name. And that's just some of the disabilities disenfranchised women faced. But in spite of Colorado's successes, the issue of woman suffrage remained controversial. A powerful anti-suffrage effort continued even in Colorado. Among the most influential of the antis was Elizabeth Cass Goddard of Colorado Springs. Now, Elizabeth was a wealthy socialite and philanthropist, and she was also vice president of the National Anti-Suffrage League. Around town here in Colorado Springs, Mrs. Goddard was known as a formidable presence in the town, and it was she who largely commanded how Colorado Springs should be run. And she was a major national influence as well. In an essay printed in the December 1910 Ladies' Home Journal, with over 1 million subscribers, by the way, she wrote, "For 28 years, I have been in the midst of the women's suffrage movement in Colorado. For years, I believed in women's suffrage and have worked day in and day out for it. I now see my mistake and would abolish it tomorrow if I could. Frankly, the experiment is a failure. It has done Colorado no good. It has done women no good. The best thing for both would be if tomorrow the ballot for women could be abolished." And here's why she thought. Here were some of the reasons. Women are temperamentally unfit to vote. They cannot eliminate the personal element. Women are not well informed on broad lines. To take the time to complete their education in these matters would necessarily take them from what is their proper sphere, the home. Women have very little appreciation of the danger to which the country will be exposed when a large number of ignorant, uneducated voters shall be turned loose upon the nation. And finally, when women become politically active and interested in politics, she loses her womanly characteristics and charm. The professional suffragist or politician is hard, aggressive, loud in voice and manner, and ready to antagonize anyone to carry her point. Well, last week, Kathy Sturtevant spoke with us about some of the business and tradition-bound institutions that were anti-woman suffragist. But here I think that Mrs. Goddard really articulated the really more personal fears that many women voters would upend the social and political order, and really chaos would reign on the home front. But at the same time, pro-suffrage forces pushed to extend the woman's suffrage. The National American Women's Association Suffrage Association had 2 million members around 1900, and it was a very, very powerful voice for women's rights. And in Colorado Springs, one of the most important of those pro-suffrage voices was Bertha Webb Fowler. Now, Bertha was an English woman who settled here in 1902, and in many ways, she mirrored Mrs. Goddard. She was a wealthy philanthropist and an influential social and civic leader. She supported many of the same charitable and cultural organizations as did Mrs. Goddard. But while Mrs. Goddard was a widow, Bertha's husband, George A. Fowler, was a health seeker, and he was a retired businessman who was heir to the Fowler Brothers Meat Packing Company, which was founded in America by his English father and uncles, who, like many of the English, sent their sons to America to manage their investments in railroad, agriculture, mining, and so on. Well, in the case of the Fowlers, not only did the British import one of their sons to help develop the post-Civil War American West, with Bertha Fowler, they also imported radical woman suffrage right here to Colorado Springs. She was an internationally prominent champion of women's rights. In England, she had belonged to the Votes for Women movement, the militant social and political union, whose radical tactics, including holding the party in power responsible for advancing women's suffrage, chaining themselves to fences, heckling politicians, and vandalizing public structures. And all of these, meant to get the vote and to bring attention to their quest, resulted in imprisonments and forcible feedings of suffragists who hunger struck to win the vote. Mrs. Fowler was chair of Colorado Women's Political Union and a leader of Colorado's equal rights movements. And in fact, I just recently read of her that it was said that when her husband died in 1928, he left her $500,000, and that she spent most of that $500,000 working on winning equal rights for women, and she died in the 1940s. In early 1913, there were 9 suffrage states, all in the American West, and gained through the difficult state-by-state constitutional change process. But as it turned out, Mrs. Goddard's concerns about the aggressive and antagonistic tactics of politicized women proved accurate when young suffragists Alice Paul and Lucy Burns persuaded the National American Women's Suffrage Association to let them form the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage to organize those few Western voting women to pressure their congressmen to work for a federal suffrage amendment. The women had met as students studying abroad in the United Kingdom after they joined the Women's Social and Political Union. Both were imprisoned for their political activism there. And when they returned to the United States, they imported the union's revolutionary tactics to the American suffrage movement. They gave up ladylike pleading and persuading of legislators for state suffrage, and the CU, which was later known as the National Woman's Party, was militant. They took up political activism and they demanded a federal woman's suffrage amendment to the Constitution, calling it the Susan B. Anthony Amendment for Women's Suffrage. Paul and Burns held the party in power responsible for advancing women's suffrage. With the 1913 election, the president and both houses of Congress were controlled by Democrats. The union's first political demonstration was a parade on Pennsylvania Avenue on March 3rd, 1913, which was the day before President Wilson's inauguration. Between 5,000 and 10,000 suffragists drew attention to the federal amendment, but also they drew attention to themselves and were attacked and jeered by bystanders, and a number of them were injured. In 1914, the Colorado branch of the Congressional Union was organized with its state headquarters in Colorado Springs under the leadership of Bertha Fowler, who was the state chairman, Lillian Carr, let's see, here is Lillian, who was the vice chairman, and Susan H.B. Gray, and I don't believe that Susie is in this picture. She hasn't been identified. If so, she was the state treasurer, and Dr. Carolyn Spencer, right there, who was the secretary. Now, I think this is a really fascinating picture of Colorado Springs history. This is a storefront, Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, Voting for Women. This is a storefront that was across the street from the 1903 courthouse, which is currently the Pioneers Museum. And this is I think, a really wonderful picture that I just found very recently. And this is, I believe, an interior shot of that storefront. And again, they're demanding the Susan B. Anthony Amendment for the enfranchisement of women. And the two identified people in here are Dr. Spencer and Mrs. Fowler. And they're working at a table with the tricolor. They're purple, white, and gold colors. And I'm not sure what they're doing, but obviously they're very interested and intrigued with everything that's going on. Dr. Spencer, Carolyn Spencer, was already a ferocious feminist when she arrived in Colorado Springs in 1893. She was seeking relief for deadly bronchial asthma, or even possibly the tuberculosis that would later kill her. She had degrees from the Philadelphia Normal School for Girls and from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, which were both hotbeds of feminism. She was a founding member of the Congressional Union, later known as the Women's Party, and remained on its advisory council until her 1928 death. Dr. Spencer was the primary organizer and leader of the Western States militant activities, and her passion and political acumen were critical in advancing women's equality until today. In August 1916, at Colorado Springs, the CU merged with the Women's Party, and it was actually considered the birth of the Women's Party, and that was led by Alice Paul. And in 1917, those organizations merged to become the National Women's Party, with the singular platform always of winning the federal women's suffrage amendment. As regional headquarters, Colorado Springs hosted suffrage conventions, parades, galas, and the members flooded legislators with suffrage petitions, meetings, phone and telegraph messages, and they campaigned against all Democratic candidates as the party in power. And again, Kathy showed us this poster last week. I just think it's such a wonderful image of the determination. This young woman is standing there with her hands on hips, very, very determined to defeat the Democratic candidates. And it says right here, our hat's in the ring. So they're ready to go. In Colorado Springs, also I have one other picture I'd really like to share with you. This again is in 1916 at the birth of the Women's Party in Colorado Springs. And this is, of course, Mrs. Fowler. And this woman right here is none other than Harriet Stanton Blatch, who is the daughter of one of our founding foremothers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she was a friend. She came here to speak at a gala and at a convention, and she spoke of Mrs. Fowler, calling her a friend, and that they had met and worked together with the English WSPU. And she wanted to share that information with our community. Well, in Colorado Springs, gender equality was definitely a source of tension, even in the high school, where politicized young women rose up against it in no uncertain terms. And this I found with the appearance of the Royal Society of Suffragettes in the 1916 Colorado Springs High School Annual, which is the present day Palmer High School. And here's the descriptor. A new society has been organized in the high school. It is both a boon to the many man-haters and a discouragement to the few male fussers. Formerly, when a girl wished to attend a function without a bid, she remained at home. But now girls can attend stunts with impunity under the protection of an already famous club. All the really peppy girls in the school belong to this organization, and we can truthfully say that we always yell louder than that stag bunch, built on a very good plan because it is modeled after ours. This budding society is indeed the principal constellation in the Colorado Springs High School firmament. Well, I'm guessing that Mrs. Goddard would have shuddered at the girls' outrageous claims for social autonomy, and perhaps even more so for their proud boasting about shouting even louder than the males. And things were only going to get worse, as Colorado Springs was, in fact, a center of radical feminism whose women did become, in Mrs. Goddard's words, aggressive, loud in voice and manner, and ready to antagonize anyone to carry her point. Dr. Carolyn Spencer knew exactly how to carry the point. She riveted the nation's attention to women's suffrage and to Colorado Springs throughout 1916. At a ceremony on Pikes Peak celebrating the birth of the Woman's Party, she raised the party's flag, calling it the emblem of the struggle for the liberation of American womanhood. She unfurled a banner demanding the amendment during a speech by Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan. Well, now that event was actually noteworthy in itself, but the story of the police confiscating and taking the banner to the city jail before returning it to Dr. Spencer is one of the foundation accounts of the National Woman's Party. In Washington, D.C., Spencer and other suffs interrupted President Wilson's speech as he recommended that Congress expand the suffrage to Puerto Rican males. The women dangled a banner from the visitor's balcony asking, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" Those events certainly were widely publicized. But with little action out of Washington, D.C., the Woman's Party turned its attention to the President and the Congress, sending women to the streets of Washington to demand the vote through a federal amendment. The first to go from Colorado Springs was Natalie Gray, the daughter of State Secretary Susie Gray. And speaking during this time as World War I was raging in Europe, Susie famously said, "I have no son to give to fight for democracy abroad, and so I send my daughter to Washington to fight for democracy at home." Natalie was arrested in August 1917 when she led a march to the White House with an incendiary banner comparing President Wilson to the tyrannical German Kaiser. Her story reveals how dangerous the demonstrations were. She said, "I have just come in from my third time doing picket duty. The experiences of a picket are thrilling, wearying, maddening, exasperating, stupid, tiresome, slow, but very convincing, very worthwhile, and necessary, I believe. To be a picket is to see with great clearness the justice of all the women's work in trying to get the speedy passage of the amendment. No girl or woman can stand for an hour and a half on Pennsylvania Avenue, holding a banner bigger than herself for passing crowds to sneer at without knowing why she does it and believing it to be necessary. Sometimes people walk by and tell us how ashamed of ourselves we should be. Such baby girls that ought to be sent home, perfect little hussies. Wonder how our mothers could raise us up to be so impudent." The news account went on and said, following the third attack on the Woman's Party pickets in Washington, in which Miss Natalie Gray took part, she sent the following letter. "A 2-hour riot between White House employees and pickets resulted in 36 of our banners being destroyed. I carried 4 of the banners. The stars and stripes were torn from our headquarters by uniformed sailors who climbed up the building. A shot was fired into the headquarters. The mob failed to stop the pickets. An outraged crowd, along with 50 police officers, attacked the women. Dozens of banners were destroyed and several women injured, including Natalie, who was attacked personally by 8 police officials. Natalie and 5 others were arrested. This is Natalie right here. And these other 5 criminals were arrested and found guilty of obstructing traffic, Refusing to pay the $10 fine, Natalie pled not guilty and served a month's sentence imprisonment at the Occoquan workhouse. In spite of those fearsome accounts out of Washington, in early September 1917, Ida Ostrom courageously joined the pickets. Now, I don't have a personal account from Ida. What I know about her is that she was a teacher, English teacher in a business school, and later, I believe, went to Denver and managed a business school up there. And at this time, I don't know about any of her Washington adventures, but Dr. Spencer told party leaders, Ida will assist you in all ways possible and help Natalie Gray represent us there. She is a most capable young woman. She is staunch and efficient and also a real revolutionist. In October 1917, Dr. Spence Lee Spencer, who was a sickly, frail woman in her mid-50s, joined the Washington protest. Her account reveals the horrendous jail conditions. A small group of suffs, including Spencer, led by Alice Paul, right there in the center, carried banners near the White House. A crowd attacked and destroyed the banners. The women, not the vandals, were arrested and found guilty of obstructing traffic. The judge suspended their sentences but threatened them with a severe penalty if they should show up in his court again. Well, of course, Paul and Spencer were arrested that same day. The angry judge sentenced them to 6 months in jail but added a 7th because of their defiance. Dr. Spencer suffered a deadly asthma attack and was released by Dr. Orda the next morning. And here's what she said. No air, no exercise was allowed. The jail was full of rats and cockroaches, and the general unsanitary conditions prevailed. The suffrage situation has reached an impasse where either the federal amendment must be put through Congress or American women permitted to die in a struggle for liberty in this land which boasts throughout the world of its democracy. Until you go to jail with these women, you cannot realize what they are being made to endure by the Democratic administration, which is imposing the enfranchisement of women for which they are struggling. Well, Dr. Spencer was recuperating in the awful jail conditions. Alice Paul demanded the suffragists be treated as political prisoners instead of criminals, and she began hunger striking in protest. In retaliation and to keep her alive, she was repeatedly force-fed, and what that amounted to was liquid, cold liquid, usually a mixture of milk with some other liquid, possibly raw eggs, or in some cases in England, brandy, was fed to the women through a rubber tube, either through their mouth or through their nose. And it was very, very upsetting. Very, very many of them were sick. They vomited repeatedly. Very humiliating and dehumanizing to the women. So as word of those abuses circulated, also Alice Paul was, at this time, was removed to a psychiatric unit for evaluation, because the thinking was that anybody who was as recalcitrant as she was and refused to quit protesting had to be mentally ill. Well, certainly tales of these abuses circulated, and 2 other local women joined the demonstrations in Washington in support of Paul and the others. And 2 of the women here is Genevieve Williams of Manitou and Ava Decker. Both of those women were arrested and found guilty of obstructing the traffic on November 12, 1917. Well, accounts differ on what happened to the 2, and so I'm going to share both accounts because I'm not really sure. In one version, their fines were paid and they were released without sentence. A different account claims that they were among 33 women taken to the Occoquan workhouse on November 14, 1917, where they experienced what is known as the infamous Night of Terror, when the Superintendent William H. Whitaker ordered nearly 40 guards to brutalize the suffragists to teach them a lesson. Guards broke into the booking room and dragged the prisoners down a hall, threw them into cells where some were badly injured. Lucy Burns' hands were chained above her head throughout the night. Another who hit her head on an iron bed was knocked unconscious. Her cellmate thought she was dead and suffered a heart attack and did not receive medical attention until the next day. Another was slammed repeatedly over the back of an iron bench. Again, I don't have personal accounts from Genevieve Williams and Ava Decker, but I do know this. I know that the effort to dominate and intimidate the political protesters into giving up their entirely legal demonstrations did not succeed. Bertha Arnold joined the White House pickets in late 1918 when she left for Washington. Carolyn Spencer told party leaders, "I made it clear to her that jail was her objective, and that whatever the most militant of you do, we expect of her. I have been talking to her mother, who was rather worried last night. We cannot wonder at such a sudden departure of her child. But she said Bertha's father said to her that she was very foolish to feel worried, because there can be no progress without just such efforts as we are making, and it is fine for Bertha to have a part in it." Bertha led multiple protests in front of the White House, in the Capitol building itself, and at the Lafayette Monument, at which, and also at other protests called Watchfires for Justice, at which suffragists burned President Wilson's words about democracy, and for which she was arrested and sentenced to a 5-day jail term. And this is, as I said, Bertha at the Lafayette Square, and she's part of a march and a pageant on that day. And here she is at watching a watchfire for justice. Well, Bertha's experiences on the streets graphically reveal how terrifying those protests were, and just how courageous the women were to persist. She said, "I've been out on the picket line, and as before, the police are unspeakable. It is unbelievable that in a civilized country, and at the country's capital at that, we should allow men of that brutality to manhandle women who come asking for liberty. I myself am unhurt because, yes, I am frank to say it. There is something in me which won't let me hang on to my banner until I am pulled down the steps or dragged to the ground by those beasts. When I let go as I do, the man who has me in charge then lets me go and has no more to say to me. I run then to Miss Paul's assistance, for they always make for her. And today they insulted her so that she rose up in the most majestic wrath you ever saw, and looked at the man who had her arms pinned back of her and all the time pinching her." Carolyn Spencer, knowing that she was risking her life, returned to Washington to take part in the Watchfires for Justice in January 1919. She was sentenced to 5 days in jail, where she hunger struck for the entire time. She was very weak when released. But speaking for all those courageous suffs who were aggressive and were loud in voice and manner, and who were ready to antagonize anyone to carry their point, and who stood picket, endured violence, and languished in jail for women's political equality, here's what Carolyn Spencer said. "Jail is not a pleasant experience, but I do not regret the time I spent there. I would return today if the act would help call attention to the glaring injustice of the administration's treatment of American women." After winning the Susan B. Anthony Amendment for Women's Suffrage, which took the effort of both the militant National Woman's Party and the moderate National American Women's Suffrage Association, the National Woman's Party knew that its work had only begun. What women needed was an Equal Rights Amendment. In the fall of 1923, at the Garden of the Gods, the National Woman's Party commemorated the 75th anniversary of the 1848 First Women's Rights Convention. And here they are dressed actually in the clothing of the time of 1848. And this is Bertha Arnold, who is dressed as Lucretia Mott. And I think this is a really fun example here of the bloomer costume, which another of our great feminist foremothers made famous when she wore it, which was the symbol of the suffragists, and she walked up Pikes Peak in it and memorialized that costume until today. Well, there at the Garden of the Gods in 1923, the National Woman's Party called for an amendment stating, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." And they called their amendment the Lucretia Mott Amendment for Equal Rights. And here's another very famous picture from 1923 that I think the local women are planning to recreate sometime in the near future to commemorate the anniversary of the winning of the 19th Amendment. Well, I just want to conclude here by saying this. With its simple statement of gender equality of rights under the law that was introduced 97 years ago, the Equal Rights Amendment apparently is so radical, such a threat to the political and social and economic order, that it has yet to become the law of the land. But in the words of the great Susan B. Anthony, who Heather Jordan introduced to us with the first of this series, Susan B. Anthony said, "Failure is impossible." And here's some readings if you're interested in following up. And the first two are actually women who participated in the Women's Party and wrote up the accounts. And the third one is the National Women's Party Papers, the film which is available, is called The Suffrage Years, 1913-1920. And that film, and there are well over 100 rolls, is available at the Special Collections of the Pikes Peak Library District, or it will be when the library is again able to open. Another primary document, and the pictures that are in this account are from the records of the National Woman's Party, and those can be viewed online. And then certainly the local story can be researched at the Pikes Peak Newsfinder Local Newspaper Index, which was created and is managed by the Special Collections of the Pikes Peak Library District. A good secondary source, and there are many more since I began this research a few years back, but Iron-Jawed Angels by Linda G. Ford, and that was made into a movie that some of you might have seen. And I don't feel comfortable necessarily touting my own work, but Dr. Carolyn Spencer and Colorado Springs Radicals for Reform is really the summary of the events that happened here in Colorado Springs. And so, Meg, if you have questions, I'd be happy to try to answer some.
Yes, thank you so much, Chris. That was fabulous. And we do have a couple questions here. Let's see here. In your research, did you find accounts or references to the influenza epidemic occurring at the same time?
Yes, particularly toward the end, 1918, 19. There were sometimes that some of the planned conventions and events had to be delayed and were shut down because of people were quarantined during that time. As you know, isn't that a surprise? but they were wearing masks and quarantine during that time.
This is a great question. Can you explain the significance of the colors white, purple, and gold here in the United States?
Well, for the suffragists, for the National Woman's Party, and for suffragists all over the world, I think, really, in fact, I actually written that down this morning because I didn't want to forget. The three colors, purple is loyalty, it's the royal color, And it talks about loyalty to a purpose. And white is certainly the color of purity, and it is the purity of the purpose. And gold is the light of the color of light and life, and it guides the purpose of the Woman's Party. So shortly, in brief, it's loyalty, purity, and life.
Yes. There's a question about Mrs. Goddard. What made her so powerful in Colorado Springs that her opinions carried so much weight?
She was extraordinarily wealthy, and she really was a philanthropist of a major force. She was one of the founders of the Colonial Dames, and certainly our historic house, McAllister House, she certainly can be appreciated for that because it's the Colonial Dames that manage that. She was one of the founders of the YWCA. She was just very, very significant on the library board. She was actually one of the founders of the protection of animals, cruelty to animals, protection from cruelty to animals, which was really one of the first ways that children and women were actually protected using some of those ideas. And so much more powerful and than I can even think of right now. She had huge familial and wealth connections throughout the country. So she was very, very important, not just here, but nationally as well.
And as a reminder, if anyone has any final questions for Chris, be sure to use the chat function, which you can find on the bottom of your Zoom screen. I did want to reference Roxanne from HPA did mention in the chat function that image is going to be recreated, which is super exciting. I hadn't seen the original image, and they're planning to do that sometime in this July. So that's pretty exciting. Let's see here. Okay, well, if there are no final questions, Chris, so many people have mentioned in the chat function how fabulous this presentation was, and thank you for your time. I did want to thank you on behalf again of the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum and the Historic Preservation Alliance of Colorado Springs. Just as a quick reminder, the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum is still closed. We're working on a plan and some direction from El Paso County Health for reopening. But if you're curious, we just ask that you check our website, cspm.org, and we'll have any updates on opening posted there. We also want to let you know that this coming August 1st, is Colorado Day. It's our Colorado Grown celebration. We're still not exactly sure what that is going to look like, but this year we wanted to focus on women's suffrage and the centennial celebration. So if that event is moving forward, we hope that you can join us on August 1st. It's going to be called Colorado Grown here on the grounds of the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum. And the focus of the event is women's suffrage. And we're going to highlight many of the organizations that participated in this fabulous series. The series will be available on the museum's YouTube channel. We already have Heather and Kathy's lectures posted, and Chris's will be posted next week. If you'd like to listen to any of these great presentations again, just head to YouTube and search for Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum. Thank you all so much, and we hope you have a wonderful weekend on this beautiful Colorado day. Take care.